Hi, I'm Taylor Zoros, and this is my CAA historical timeline for EDTP 3301 for Texas Tech University. This is the timeline of court and law cases. The first one is Brown v. Board of Education, which was in 1954. The second one is the Civil Rights Act, which is in 1964. The third one is Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was in 1965. The fourth is the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. The fifth is Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974. The sixth one is Lau v. Nichols of 1974. The seventh one is Casadena v. Pickard in 1981. The eighth one is Plyer v. Joe in 1982. The ninth one is No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. And finally, the 10th one is Williams v. California in 2004. We are now going to look at a summary of the top 10 educational law and court cases that were just discussed previously on the timeline. Starting with Brown v. Board of Education, this was a Supreme Court case that was ruled unanimously that having racial segregation of children in public schools was considered unconstitutional. The 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, led to the integration of public schools in America. In his lawsuit, Brown claimed that schools for black children were not equal to the white schools and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which holds that no state can deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Brown v. Board of Education was one of the cornerstones of civil rights movements. To make known that separate but equal education services was actually not equal at all. By separating these students, they were not being treated equal to others. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places and facilities and also banned any employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. First proposed by President John F. Kennedy, it survived strong opposition from Southern members of Congress and was then signed into law by Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson in order to provide additional resources for low-income and poverty-struck students. This offered and created scholarships for low-income college students. It also offered grants to districts that were recognized as low-income. The act was signed into law on April 9, 1965, and its appropriations were to be carried out for 5 fiscal years. The government has reauthorized the act every 5 years since its enactment. The purpose of the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was to provide additional resources for vulnerable students. The Bilingual Education Act of 1968 was known as the first United States federal legislation that had recognized the needs of limited English-speaking ability students, also known as ELLs. This meaning that the government would provide financial assistance and stability for innovative bilingual programs in order to help and meet the needs of ELLs. Funding would be provided for the development of such programs and for implementation, staffing and staff training, and long-term program maintenance. The Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974 is a federal law of the United States of America. This law prohibits discrimination against any faculty, staff, and students, as well as including any racial segregation of students in a school. It requires school districts to make sure there are no barriers to any student's equal participation. It is one of a number of laws affecting educational institutions, including the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. Lau v. Nichols of 1974 was a court case in which the court had decided unanimously that the lack of supplemental language instruction in any public schools for students with limited English proficiency, also known as English language learners, the court had ruled that because non-English speakers were denied a meaningful education, that this violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This resulted in making sure the school provided students with appropriate relief. The school district countered that its policies were not discriminatory because it offered the same instruction to all students regardless of national origin. The Casadena v. Pickard of 1981. This case was based upon a father of two Mexican-American children. Mr. Casadena had claimed that his children's school was discriminating his children because of their ethnicity. He had argued that the students in the classroom were being segregated based upon grouping by both race and ethnicity. School districts were required to establish bilingual education according to the Lau v. Nichols ruling, yet there was no way to evaluate the adequacy of the school's approach. Consequently, sometimes it could result in an inadequate separation. This case was tried on August 17, 1978. The judge ruled in favor of the defendant, stating that the district had not violated any of the plaintiff's constitutional or statutory rights. Plyer v. Doe was a case in which the Supreme Court had struck down both a state statute denying funding for education to the undocumented immigrant children in the school's district. The school had tried to charge an annual $1,000 tuition fee for each undocumented student in order to compensate for any lost state funding. The court had ruled that this violated the rights of the students because they were being mistreated due to their immigration status. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 is one of the more recent educational laws that have been put into place. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 was an act of Congress that had reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This included provisions applying to disadvantaged students. This act was placed in order to improve the performance of American schools by enabling all students to achieve the state standards of academic knowledge, especially in reading and mathematics. Under the 2002 law, states are required to test students in reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. Williams v. California of 2004 was also one of the more recent education court cases. Williams v. California was a lawsuit that was filed by the ACLU against the state of California. This was filed because of the horrible conditions in many of their public schools. Parents, as well as students and even teachers, had argued that the state of California had failed to provide thousands of public school students, and especially those in low-income communities and communities of color, the basic necessities required for an education. This is my works cited and reference page, and it lists a variety of different links, websites, and online books, and where I found all of my information used on this PowerPoint.